Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the second game here, or fourth game of the season, between the San Jose Sharks and the St. Louis Blues, in which the Sharks have won 2-1 in a shootout. So the Sharks do have a 2-2 record on the year, and do technically have 4 points in the standings, though 2 shootout wins are certainly one of the more precarious wins to receive, and if things come down to tiebreakers at the end of the year, the Sharks will technically be counted for having 0 wins currently. But at the moment, still pretty positive feelings, especially after tonight's game. Likely, I would say, their best game of the season thus far. They played a pretty solid game against St. Louis, and they really tackled the important issues of what has plagued them through the first 3 games of this year. The Sharks cracked down defensively. They didn't give too much to the St. Louis Blues, and while their offense wasn't maybe rolling as much as it had been, or at least they weren't converting on quick opportunities as they had been through the first 3 games, they managed to bring it into overtime, tied at 1, and eventually force a shootout. So the first goal of this game was Brayden Schenn in the second period. The Sharks would tie it up with a great Marcus Sorensen, sort of Bobby Orr style-esque goal because of his diving play here. And as I said, overtime would come. The Sharks would think they would end this game with about 11 seconds to go in the overtime, as Kevin Labanc would put it into a seemingly empty net, but unfortunately it would get called off for goalie interference. What had happened on this play is that Erik Karlsson did a great move and completely faked out Jordan Binnington. Binnington found himself way out of his net. Karlsson goes around it and passes it out in front for Labanc for the easy tap-in goal, except for in the crease, Ryan Donato, a bit of a lack of awareness there. He's standing directly inside the crease, so Jordan Binnington has no chance to try and get back into the net and make that save. And honestly, if Donato isn't in the crease, Binnington would have been able to get back into the net, but he would not have had time to get settled, and Labanc likely still manages to score there. But because of this sort of lack of awareness by Donato to just sort of step a foot right outside of the crease to not have this goaltender interference occur, it ends up being called off. But luckily for the Sharks, while it didn't go as smoothly as they didn't pot as many goals, Jones made a few key saves in the shootout, and eventually it would be Tomas Hertl scoring the only goal to get the Sharks the win. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones. He comes back in between the pipes for this one after Dubnyk played the first game against St. Louis, led in 5 in that one, and Martin Jones was very solid. Again, there weren't any super spectacular saves, but he made a couple of pretty nice ones, and especially his shootout performance was quite solid. Only led in this 1 goal against Brayden Schenn, which was a bit of a defensive breakdown, which is not really much of a surprise coming from the Sharks. It had been Brent Burns who pushed off Jordan Kyrou from the puck, and it was a loose puck at that point. Nobody in the Sharks felt the need to actually skate up to that and clear it away from the front. Only Brayden Schenn really activated his speed and managed to get to it and just take the free shot pretty close in front of the net. So a tough one for Martin Jones, certainly. But in the end, a solid win for him. The 2 wins the Sharks have this season have both been games where Jones has looked good, and the 2 losses the Sharks have had this season are 2 games where the combination of Jones and Dubnyk haven't looked all that great. So clearly goaltending is key. That's not some sort of crazy revelation for most NHL teams, but for the Sharks here, it seems as though if Jones is playing well, the Sharks do have chances to win these games, even against some of the top teams in the NHL like the St. Louis Blues. Next, I'll be talking about the power play, and it's kind of weird that I would mention the power play in this review compared to the 3 previous reviews, because of course the Sharks power play was really the only thing clicking through the first 3 games, sort of like how last season the only thing clicking through that season was the penalty kill. And so tonight the Sharks ended up going, I believe, 0 for 7 on the power play, including a couple of very brief 5-on-3 opportunities. But why I wanted to mention the power play here tonight was because of the excitement and the movement and the good play that I had been seeing on it. Even though they didn't actually manage to score a goal here tonight, they certainly had some opportunities, and I've been extremely impressed with how the power play has looked just skill-wise through these first 4 games. Usually when the Sharks, especially last season when they have been putting Karlsson and Burns on the main power play with, whatever 3 combination of forwards, either that being Hertl, Couture, Kane, or Meyer at some point, or Labanc at some point, whenever those 5 players came on the ice as a first power play unit, they really looked out of sync, out of sorts, with zero chemistry, but something seemingly has clicked this season, at the very least on the power play, since very little has clicked for the Sharks, at least up to this point in this game. But the power play is the bright spot here, and even though it wins 0-7, as I'll say again, it does look like it's going to be a force to be reckoned with this season, or at least I hope that can continue. Next, I'll mention Evander Kane, just a brief mention of Kane. He put up, in his first 3 games, 6 penalty minutes, which is not great, but I guess not terrible. However, here tonight, he got 8 penalty minutes, and that is 4 minor penalties. And for those of you counting, the Sharks as a team only ended up getting 4 minor, well, I guess technically 5. Brent Burns ended up taking 1 right at the end of overtime, so I will spare Kane that. But the fact is that through regulation, the Sharks took 4 minor penalties, all of them from Evander Kane. In particular, 1 was taken in the offensive zone on the power play for the San Jose Sharks, and extremely undisciplined. This wasn't, let's say, a hook that was made onto a player who was about to clear a zone, which is still not great, but also is somewhat more understandable. But instead, he just sort of turns around and slashes Jordan Binnington in the midsection. And while I don't know, obviously this probably wasn't a super hard slash and Binnington maybe overreacts, it's still just a very unnecessary play. So hopefully Kane can clean up the disciplinary sort of tendencies here. He had 3 points in his first game of this season. It looked good, but he has now been pointless in the last 3 games, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll see if he can pick that up and maybe lay off the penalties. And finally, I'll talk about another defenseman here, but not the usual Karlsson, not the usual Brent Burns, but instead Mario Ferraro. So after a pretty strong rookie campaign in the previous season, he came into this year looking to be the 5th defenseman on the San Jose Sharks, but with these sort of lingering knee issues that Simek has been dealing with, Ferraro has had to step into a top 4 role, and he has actually looked quite good in that role. I mean, you look at just tonight, Simek only playing 10 minutes or so of ice time, which is very low for Simek standards. You could definitely tell that there's still some sort of issue there, even if he's able to make it into the lineup. And Ferraro ended up getting over 22 minutes here tonight, and those were pretty solid 22 minutes. I've been quite impressed with Ferraro. Certainly is developing into a rather well-rounded defenseman. And if you sort of take into account expectations at the very least, you could very well say that Ferraro has been the Sharks' best defenseman this season, with how Karlsson, Burns, and even Vlasic have looked at times through these first 4 games. So Ferraro has been quite impressive, and the Sharks absolutely needed him to be, with these issues that are ongoing with Radim Simek. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday, and we'll see if they can finally get a victory outside of the shootout. Class dismissed.